What's true for business is true for supply chain. There's a saying, and it can't be more true than right now, that not the largest or the fastest actually, but the most adaptable will survive. I think this is the time to adapt. I mean, every day there is news coming, and because we operate stores in 45 cities, and cities have different time of store being allowed to be open, essentials, then phone delivery, then in some places e-commerce. I think you have to adapt every day and be agile. Now we all have traveled a long distance in the supply chain world, from delivery in a week, let's say a decade or 2 decades back, to now same day delivery, and even successful in delivering within 2 hours many times. And undoubtedly, we've become better at dealing with the high probability, low impact events such as defects or delayed delivery of purchase items. But I think today, many operations are very vulnerable and susceptible to low probability but high impact events like coronavirus or COVID-19, which are occurring actually now with more frequency than before. And not just because of issues arise more frequently, but because issues that used to stay isolated now, I think have far-reaching impacts on this globally interconnected market environment. We have a chain called Nature's Basket with stores in Mumbai, Pune, and Bangalore, and we sell a lot of international food. And you can imagine international food comes from all over the world, from Spain, from Italy, from US. So it's actually an interconnected world. And I'll come to what Vineet you said, local supply chain. I think that's a big trend. Even I see it happening. So such low probability and high impact, unprecedented mass disruption and what we call nowadays black swan events, I think they're capsizing the supply chains and causing a lasting damage to the function itself. Also in today's hyper-associated supply chain environment, I think the risks are evolving at a continuous pace, and they can strike from anywhere. Whoever could have guessed COVID coming from one part of the world and becoming global. So I think in true sense, everything is global now, including the issues. And these are unforeseen times. So I say that we have a twin challenge to manage in business. One is that we are in a more uncertain world. We are truly in the most uncertain world, and we all in business used to have these phrases called disruption, and everybody used to use the word disruption in every second line, that business got disrupted, or this category. I think truly for the first time in our lives, we are actually realizing what disruption means. This is true disruption. And second is rising complexity in terms of the scale, geography, the assortment, the range. I think regulatory challenges and customers evolving, especially post-COVID, changes in consumer behavior on consumption and whatnot. And I think these unprecedented events disrupt the supply chain, creating what you mentioned, we need the bullwhip effect. I mean, how do you forecast? How do you know post-COVID which items will sell more? How do you plan demand? Which suppliers to connect to? And that this is also due to consumers' varying demand and the lack of coordination and exchange of information amongst supply chain partners many times, starting with retailers and expanding, eventually reaching manufacturers, producers, and even suppliers. In the first and the second, in upstream suppliers, I think they suffer the most. The second and the third tier of supply chain are usually small. And I think the small ones cannot withstand the initial downturn or downdraft in orders or business. And I think this can be a big challenge for small manufacturers. Disruptive risks, I think, tend to have a domino effect, which we are seeing right now in the supply chain. I think any impact in one area, like for example, a supply or a fire happening in one plant or shutting off one plant in one part of the country, I think has a ripple effect in other areas. I think such a risk can't be addressed by holding additional parts. Historically, we've got used to cost being the biggest determinant of designing the whole supply chain. But I think no more, I think only cost can be a determinant as an efficiency factor. I think by contrast, recurrent risks such as demand fluctuation or supply delays tend to be independent. I think they can normally be covered by good supply chain management practices, such as having the right inventory at the right place. I think supply chain earlier, 10, 15 years back, or even actually till recently, was all about network balancing and network planning optimization, where cost was core to decision making for the supply chain managers to design the network chain and procure with lowest cost lever in mind. But I think the pandemic is likely to change this equation. It already has. And a new variable is getting introduced in the decision making that you can't put all eggs in one basket, simply put. I think if something goes wrong, entire chain will get disrupted. Therefore, the emphasis will shift away from lowest cost in designing supply chain to cost optimization plus risk mitigation. We cannot any further ignore that risk may happen at a larger frequency than in the past. And I think relying on sole source suppliers or common parts and centralized inventory, I think makes supply chain more vulnerable to such disruptive risk as the time we live in right now. Although sourcing from and outsourcing to low distant cost locations and eliminating excess capacity and redundant suppliers may make supply chain more cost efficient, like, only buying from one supplier overseas. But I think such actions also make supply chains more vulnerable. Like for now, in a couple of cases, cold chain getting disrupted or ships being stuck, or in our case, trucks were stuck initially carrying non-essentials, and those same trucks were to be emptied and to be used for essentials in the early days. That was a huge challenge. And I think these have potential, and huge damage to and financial implications when they occur. Now, low-cost offshore suppliers with long lead times leave companies vulnerable to a long period of shutdown when particular location or transportation route experience problems, especially in the global world. I think so. What do companies have to think? Companies should think beyond short-term disruption to the long-term company survival itself, including supply chain, including having the raw material, including being able to source. So I think at this stage, it would be safe for me to say that the COVID-19 episode, I think it will lead to permanent changes in the global supply chain, including in India. And so going forward, the rules of the game will be to pursue both variables simultaneously: supply chain efficiencies and risk reduction, and not one. And how can one manage risk reduction? I think by and large, four things come to my mind in which we have to invest time and plan. I think one, you have to segment the supply chain. Two, you have to regionalize the supply chain. Three, and I'm speaking more even as a retailer, that you have to avoid extreme concentration of resources. And lastly, fourth, you need to nudge trade-off in favor of reducing risk by overestimating the likelihood of a disruption. You need to plan. You need to have it in the planning stage. And we also need to remember that no two disruptions are the same. So it's like a moving target. And therefore, no one-size-fits-all solution can be planned for the foreseeable future. And if I have to take a little bit peek into the future, I think it's about resiliency and an ability to adapt to changes. And I'll go back to that. I think adapting as a business, adapting as supply chain is the need of the hour in the marketplace. And new business models will evolve. The world will be different tomorrow. I think that will also be the key to disruption-proofing supply chain. I think we all have, in the supply chain function, we all have to come together to meet the challenge. I think in this world, the idea that companies can optimize the supply chain once and for all circumstances and for all customers, I think that would be living in a fantasy world. I think at the critical point being building resilience for the future. And that can begin with establishing a supply chain risk function like we started within Spencer's and Nature's Basket in the early days when the lockdown started. That first, assess the risk. Second, continually update what is the risk impact, estimate it, and plan for mitigation strategies. Third and lastly, I think overseeing risk governance. I think we also need to start thinking of the process and tools which got created during the crisis management period, I'm sure in all companies, that they should get codified into formal documentation. Like all of us have a BCP, sort of a business continuity process. I think even supply chain needs to embed in have its own document. And that document needs to be a permanent fixture to monitor supply chain risk continuously and reliably. I think over a period of time, Vineet, you mentioned that 2 to 12 months, and I completely agree. It will take that kind of time for us to know what is the true impact. Over time, stronger supplier collaboration can likewise reinforce an entire supplier ecosystem. Like for people like us, we are dealing with hundreds, probably actually thousands of suppliers of food, grocery, essentials, non-food, even though we're not selling right now general merchandise, apparel. And I think the only way forward, I will leave in the end, I think 6 points to my mind, which we all need to think, and no way is this exhaustive, but they come to my mind that first, I think we need to integrate the supply chain. Vinith, you also mentioned that digitization of everything. I think you need to onboard the whole of supply chain on a digital platform end to end. So there's visibility. Second is to ensure the visibility of supply chain to your partners. Like we could develop a war room, our supply chain at Spencer's and Nature's Basket and our suppliers, the big FMCG companies, including the smaller one. So we could track the trucks. So we could reduce the truck turnaround times because in the beginning, labor and truck was at shortage. Of course, at the front end, we did a massive tie-up with Ubers and Rapido and delivery, but that's a separate conversation. So I'm saying give visibility to your partners. They may not be your company, but the fact that they are your partners in the back end and the front end, it needs to be seamless. And establish the critical incident management team with symbiotic collaboration. We have a famous thing in retail called joint business planning. With the whole planning, forecasting what we're going to sell this week, this month, which category in summer, in winter, is jointly decided. I think that team needs to work now even more closely because post COVID, how do you decide that if it's summer is left, how much soft drink will sell, or if summer's left and people haven't bought summer clothes, how much apparel will sell? And if factories haven't worked, then how much of winter production will even happen for apparel, and thus how much can you get? I think if you don't work very closely with suppliers, it's going to be a challenge. Fourthly, anticipating and managing the evolving customer demand, and I'll go back to it. Some of the consumer behavior and consumption patterns have changed. Like I was reading, one of the category is down by 54% in one of the media reports simply because of not being available right now. And 30, 40 days it's not available. So permanent behavior change have happened. Similarly, which other category? We have thousands of them which we sell online and offline. Which ones will change? And historical growth rates of demand forecasting may not work. Fifth, control and optimization as per evolving needs. I go back and I spoke about it like BCP for business. I think supply chain management has to have its own evolving and update time to time its own BCP. And lastly, I think it's all about culture. We all can speak as much, we all can speak what may happen in the future. I think eventually you have to create a culture of disruption preparedness. I think it all boils down to culture in the end.